At Chairman Fry's request, I went ahead and compiled for the county party a list of the Supreme Court candidates we're expecting to run in 2016 and how they stack up to each other in terms of performance so that we can decide who to endorse. A lot of times it's very difficult to compare candidates because their districts are so different or the races they ran in were very different. But this time around, we actually have an advantage. They're all appellate judges currently sitting, and they all ran either for re-election or for the first time in 2012. And to add to that, they also all ran in districts that Obama ended up winning by about 6 or 7 points. So there's a lot of similarities that are going to allow us to make some very tight comparisons. We'll go ahead and start by looking at what those key differences are. The first is going to be the margin of victory. How well do they actually perform against their opponent? The second is we have to look at whether or not they were an incumbent, a challenger, or whether or not the seat was an open race, since that has a big effect in terms of incumbency, typically granting an advantage. Next, we'll actually look at whether or not they performed well compared to Romney in their district. And then spending, in terms of how much they spent compared to their opponent, and a second half of spending, how many dollars they spent per vote they actually got. Not all the districts are the same size, so that makes a bit of a difference. There are a lot of other factors that we really can't include here. We're going to try to hope that most of those show up under margin of victory, which we're including even though we've got things like spending and incumbency in there. It should help us to look at all those other factors we can't account for in some kind of generalized objective sense. But one of the 900-pound gorillas in the room is how often we elect people with very Irish names into the Supreme Court or into our courts in general. And when you look at a lot of the races, like Cupp versus O'Neill, where Cupp massively outspent O'Neill and was the incumbent and still lost by a few points, or the most recent one with French versus O'Donnell, where she massively outspent him as an incumbent and just barely held on in a year where the Republicans did very well statewide, one has to kind of acknowledge that that makes a very large impact that we can't ignore. If you look at the other races like Kenney versus Letson, or O'Donnell versus Skindell, O'Connor's various races, they did very well compared to the ones who did not have that Irish surname, like Lanzinger and Cupp. And as much as one tries not to think about ethnicity, gender, and things like that in these races, one can't completely ignore them. So we're just going to note them and move on to those things that we can objectively look at. So what we will do is produce this scorecard where we weight each of the 5 categories equally on a scale of 1 to 4, since we have 4 candidates. The highest one will go to be number 4, so that we can add these all up at the end to give us a nice clean number. So our first category, as mentioned, is margin of victory. And again, while we can't look at this in a vacuum, we can't ignore it as a factor because so many things that are smaller categories are going to get lumped in under this. And again, a score of 4 is the highest, whereas 1 is going to be the person who performed the least well. In our first category, in terms of the raw margin of victory, Judge DeWine's performance really stands out. He had a 22-point margin of victory, whereas nobody else managed to break double digits. Our other 3 candidates all had decent showings, single-digit victories that were quite respectable, pretty close together there. Our next category, challenge rating, is just comparing how hard the race is objectively, in terms of whether it was an open seat, whether their opponent was an incumbent, or they themselves were an incumbent. And here, because we can't really rank them, we'll just say that the challenger is worth 4 points if they are running against an incumbent, whereas someone who ran unopposed is worth only 1 point. And here we have Judge O'Toole coming up on top because she was the only one who faced an incumbent. In fact, one who had just run for Supreme Court against Lanzinger the previous cycle. Pat DeWine ran for an open seat, whereas the other 2 candidates were both incumbents. So we award them 4, 3, and 2 points respectively. And when we go ahead and look at that scorecard so far, that's how we have it set up. As you can see, the first column for margin of victory, we have their points awarded. In the second one for challenge rating, we have their points awarded and their total on the far right. We'll pop this back up a couple more times before we get to the end. Now, comparison to Romney is a separate category than margin of victory because it makes a really big difference whether or not somebody is running in a very strongly Republican or Democrat district. So in terms of how they performed in terms of Romney, again, we see Judge DeWine standing out. He outperformed Romney by double digits, whereas everybody else clustered together pretty closely in a 4 to 7 point margin. The next category is spending versus their opponent. How much do they spend? How much do their opponents spend? 2016, especially in Ohio, is going to be a very tight budget year for the party. state and local. And people who spent the money more efficiently or who were able to win when they were outspent has got to be viewed as a big positive going into this. So we have some pie charts here just showing the percentage of it. Again, these are not the same size districts and they didn't all spend the same amount of money on media. So we're just going to look at it straight comparison, how much their opponents spend versus them as a percentage. And in these pie charts we see that Judge O'Toole was outspent about 4-1, whereas Judge Fisher outspent his opponent almost 100-1. So we are going to rank them with that in mind. So let's bring our scorecard back up for a quick comparison again to this point. Again, the totals are to the far right in each category as we progressed is scored there, with 4 being the highest and 1 being the lowest in terms of their performance. Our last category, which is the second spending category, or dollars spent per vote. Again, the appellate court districts are not population equal the way legislative districts tend to be. And of course, not everybody won by the same margin. So we're looking at the amount of money they spent per every vote they got. And for kind of a contrast here, we often have these Supreme Court races cost us around $1 million for somebody to win. And if that was a 50% vote, that would run about 30 to 40 cents per vote in terms of the kind of outputs of voter turnout that we get in presidential years. So when we look at that spending, we see a very stark contrast. Judge O'Toole, as a challenger, spent only 17 cents apiece for each vote that she got against a very strong incumbent, whereas Pat DeWine spent the next least, about twice as much, for an open seat race. And the two incumbent judges, Fisher and DeGennaro, spent twice as much as he did to retain seats they already had. So when we look at our 5 categories that we've identified as key differences between these races, we see, probably to no one's surprise, that Judge DeWine comes out on top. Then Judge Colleen O'Toole comes in as a very close second, and Pat Fisher and Mary DeGennaro come in roughly tied for third place. All 4 judges have very respectable showings and would probably be very strong candidates, but DeWine and O'Toole come up ahead. And there are 2 seats available, so those would be the 2 that would make the most sense to pick. We'll go ahead and give each one their own individual pros and cons, though, before we finish up. For Pat DeWine, the pros are pretty straightforward. He has very strong name recognition. He's probably going to be a very powerful fundraiser. And in his race, which was an open seat, he performed amazingly well against an opponent who was pretty decently funding. The only con against him is that his name is strongly associated to the Republican Party, and that may discourage uninformed left-leaning voters, and there are going to be a fair number of them in 2016. Similarly, O'Toole has mostly positives on her side. She unseated an opponent who had just run for the Supreme Court, who outspent her enormously, and she won almost every county she had, and the one that she did lose was one that Romney ended up losing by roughly 2-1. The main con against her is that she has no real pre-existing statewide recognition the way that Pat DeWine does, but the name is very likely to appeal to voters. For Judge DeGennaro, her major pro is also a bit of a con. She was able to retain her seat by a decent margin, even though her opponent outspent her about 2-1. The problem is that her opponent was able to outspend her about 2-1. Incumbents usually raise a lot more money than the challengers do. The other aspect is that DeGennaro lost 3 of her 8 counties, and 2 of those were run by Mitt Romney in 2012. Lastly, Judge Fisher, it has to be noted again that he beat his opponent by 9 points. However, he outspent his opponent while he was an incumbent 100-1 and still did not get a double-digit victory. And this is in the same district that Pat DeWine had just won by 21-22 points for an open seat when he was running against somebody who had about the same amount of money as he did. So this has to be taken into account. This was a race against a very weak opponent. So at the end of the day, when we look at the 2 available seats we have and the 4 candidates we have, while they all look to be pretty strong candidates who would have a very good chance of winning, Judge DeWine and Judge O'Toole just come up on top by a very clear margin. And as best we can tell from objective analysis, those would be the ones most logical for us to endorse as a county party. Hope you found this informative, and thanks for watching.